Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumdunker channel. This is of course a strange, unconventional music show diving into all sorts of different albums, right? So of course in today's episode we are continuing our journey into the discography of Swans, with a look at the live album counterpart to the band's previous studio album of Love of Life. Definitely a bit often peculiar in places, I would say, but this is also a fascinating document of the power that Swans music had when they performed live, of course. Sometimes at least. I'll be honest, I'm not exactly sure this one is a favourite of mine, but there is a lot of different parts I enjoyed across the length of the album. It's often the way with Swans albums, you're not going to like absolutely everything, are you? But this one was still very interesting, so I'm actually very excited to talk about it. So today I present Omniscience by Swans. So, of course, who were Swans when Omniscience was released? Well, this album features a bit more of a pared-down version of the band, apparently. We, of course, still have Michael Gira at the forefront on vocals and guitar, backed up by Jarbo on vocals and keyboards, of course. Alongside them, they are joined by Clinton Steele on guitar, Algis Kaziz on bass guitar, and Vince Signorelli taking the drum duties. And that was it, apparently. This was apparently the lineup for the band on these particular recordings that, during this tour, it seems. So then, what is Omniscience? Well, this is a live album from the 1992 World Tour in support of the band's most recent release of Love of Life, which we covered in our last episode. And so this one interpolates a rather interesting track list, sourced mostly from Love of Life, but also featuring a few tracks from White Light from the Mouth of Infinity, and also from the World of Skin albums. We essentially have, essentially a little time capsule of the band's live shows from this era, All in all, a very fascinating document of the band, with the sound having a lot more clarity than what we experienced in the previous live album we looked at, Anonymous Bodies in an Empty Room. This actually might be due to some reworking of the songs in a studio, though. Which, in the form of overdubs, essentially, which gives the albums a little bit more grip. But then I'm a bit sort of in two minds about it, because I feel like it's a little bit disingenuous to have a live album that is, supported by, studio recordings, but at the same time, is it that big a deal? Probably not. It certainly helps the album sound a lot better than the previous one, so, you know what? It's up to everyone to make their own opinions on, but I'm definitely getting ahead of myself here. So let's just dive in and discuss all the different tracks we have here, shall we? So, Omniscience, opening up with Mother's Milk, a track we haven't actually covered yet, as this will make an appearance on the next studio album. So this starts off the proceedings with a delightfully chunky riff, some lovely electric guitar tones over this regimented militant beat, all descending heavily on this singular beat every few bars. Within it all, it just feels like that growing maelstrom of instrumentals, thus adding this sort of controlled chaotic noise that just starts to swirl and swirl in our very ears, slowly launching everything off with this rather slow yet rather enjoyable pace, until it all just descends to give room for Jarbo to take it away on the lead vocals here. And my goodness, what a vocal performance she gives on this one. Very loud and commanding, and so much chunk and grit to it on certain lines in the song. It creates a really wonderful album opener that paves the way nicely for the entire live set, or just the entire album, that kind of captures, that kind of grandiose style of majestic, elegant music that Swans were creating at the time, leaving a lot of room following the vocals from some lovely instrumental passages, swirling and colliding in such a wonderful fashion as the distortion just rings out in your ears. It's very interesting, as it's a song I've never really delved into all that much, as we haven't actually come across it yet, have we? But it seems to work as a brilliant opener here, though. One that feels very big and majestic in scale, and perfectly ties into the aesthetic that the band were pushing out at the time. It's weird, as there's this almost kind of stadium rock feel to how the whole thing is sounding, which is very welcome following the rather poor quality of the previous live album as mentioned. But as mentioned again, studio interference by Jira here does help flesh out the sound, but it does create that sense of inauthenticity. But irrespective of that though, it's still a wonderful sounding track and a perfectly ferocious opener. So moving along, we get the next song, Pow R Sac, which is a weirdly named version of Power and Sacrifice from What Light at the Mouth of Infinity that has been reworked into something very bizarre here. So as this one begins, we have a menacing tone instantly coming through with the stabs of synth and drums, and the ever-climbing and colliding guitar lines just mixing in over one another in a fantastic fashion. It offers up a very lengthy introduction to the song, really giving those guitars time to display some very brilliant tones, just a lovely sense of fuzz and distortion coming through, before it all just then falls into this very peculiar version of the song itself, one caught in a multitude of effects, and they're almost reverse at times as it just creates this disorientating miasma. It is miles apart from the album's counterpart, and especially with that middle instrumental, I'll be honest, it's not really a favourite of mine, though I do love the extended opening and outro section. With it being so vastly different is perhaps why it's been named differently to its album counterpart, though, of course, this sort of abbreviated version of Power and Sacrifice with Pow R Sac. Perhaps anyway. But it's still interesting, seeing how it pushes the pacing along in such a fascinating way, just terrorizing us with this fervent and manic aesthetic of chaos and discordance almost. And as well, how it all just ends in this wonderful deluge of distorted feedback that drones and drones with such wonderfully thick tones. It kind of just slaps you around the face in the process, just a bombardment of guitar-led density. And although I don't like it all that much, arguably, I do appreciate its placing here, though, as it does help just guide us along nicely with the whole aesthetic that this album is going to be presenting to us. So we then next have Will Serve, another song I haven't come across yet, but first time for everything, right? So this one opens up with a kind of jangle rock aesthetic, a nice drive from the guitars and tapping of the cymbals, kind of stepping over itself as it rushes faster and faster though as it all progresses, before we then get a descend of keyboard notes, that we find ourselves in familiar territory here. Essentially a brief instrumental interlude of the musical portion of the track, Will We Survive? And what we have instead is just that intense electronic driving force that just warps through, going faster and faster it feels, building up its intensity as the drums hit harder, all the time pushing that faint little melody as the guitars get louder and more discordant. Weirdly enough, I kind of like this version though, irrespective of the last track, which was a reworking of Power and Sacrifice, wasn't that big a fan. This one, the reworking of Will We Survive, I kind of like though. I'll be honest, it's kind of missing that sort of movie gravitas that the studio recording has, but I actually can't help but feel elated by the sheer power that the performance has that's being offered here. That intense drive being pushed by the entire band as it just starts to elevate higher and higher it feels. Weird as I feel like I shouldn't be enjoying it that much, but I just find myself enthralled the entire length of this track, and as a result, it's actually a bit of a highlight for me. So moving along, we actually get to the longest track on the album, an 8.5-minute version of the track, Her. So opening up with some light airy drones and gentle cymbals, this song takes loads of time to establish the setting though, just essentially creating this really lush, colourful environment for us, before the guitar just gently descends into the scene with that really beautiful, gentle riff. And again, there is something so ethereal and grand here, and I appreciate how the track really takes its time to get itself going, just creating this lovely bed of instrumentals that kind of just wrap around you like a warm blanket of sorts. And from there, the melody slowly starts to form, leading that way for Jira's croon, that sounding oddly like the kind of thing you'd hear from Off the Wall, no, kind of like that thing you'd hear from the album The Wall by Pink Floyd, actually, especially with that level of reverb added to his vocal performance, a bit of an odd comparison, but even with the instrumental palette though, I feel it's kind of got that sort of aesthetic that that Roger Waters would do, if that makes sense. At least I feel like it, different things to different people, of course, but regardless, it is a lovely song, and it just guides itself through this lovely lyrical tribute to the one and only Jarbo, as we knew from the previous video, right? But it does the same kind of thing, you know, of suddenly descending into that heavy, chunky, noisy section, you know, midway through. And I feel like this is kind of a reflection of the many facets of Jarbo's character, you know, her soft human side, and then her intensity in this lengthy instrumental, especially in the way she performs it as an artist, perhaps. I do feel like this particular version, it kind of lacks that sort of smashing around the face feeling that Jira was aiming for when writing the song. But the way in which the guitars just climb in and around each other with this driving motoric instrumental performance makes for something really spectacular, I feel. A kind of prototype for those lengthy instrumental dirges from the later years, though, of course, like repeating the same sections, letting that noise build up and up to create that cataclysm miasma before it all fades away into a deluge of noise and feedback. And here is where you get another lengthy instrumental note, just this oddly placed drone that circles around and around and around, becoming slower and slower and slower as the distortion of voices effects just starts to suddenly come through again. This murky swamp of low end before you get that sample of Jarbo speaking on the phone, speaking of aspirations. And this just ends so wonderfully and so brilliant. Like, it makes the whole thing come across as one of the best tracks off of this whole album, I feel. Like, the original track, Her, one of my favourite things from Love of Life, I have to say. And even with that sort of middle section, that's, you know, the slap around the face part, not being something that I was a big fan of on the previous one, it sounds not as chunky here, but still kind of brilliant, especially with the fact that there's so much more drone and feedback here. And especially how it then just leads the way for Jarbo's voice, you know, to come through with that vocal sample. But like, I just have to say, it's such a wonderfully atmospheric track though, one that feels, you know, even, you know, still ferocious in its own right, I feel, you know, having, you know, enough grit and energy, I feel, to make it one of the standout tracks on this album. So, moving along, we get a very interesting track here. We get a cover of Nick Drake with Swans' rendition of Black Eyed Dog. This originally appeared on the World of Skin album. So it seems like the more we do this, the more we ought to dive into that particular album, right? Maybe we'll at some point, we probably ought to. Anyway, this track, it kind of just fades in from the previous one with a rather angular riff on the guitar, accompanied by the tap of cymbals to create a very gentle, lengthy intro, as the bass comes in to just shoot it off before we get that peculiar yet fascinating little vocal performance from Jarbo. This dramatic half whisper of sorts, sounding so sinister in its own right. So this version is worlds apart from the original version by Drake White, which opts for his customary style of sublime acoustics to back his own vocal performance against. What's interesting here is how Swans have really pulled out this rather sinister and bitter edge to it though, making for a very fascinating track, especially in the chorus sections, when Jarbo just really lets loose, you know, snarling and screeching with this wonderful edge to her vocals, sounding so commanding and full of this amazing presence before the band just starts to push it all along again. Very interesting, and I feel like it's very fitting in this whole live album experience though I can't say I prefer it to the original version. Like I can appreciate what the band and what Jarbo are trying to do with it. They've certainly given it a very different vibe, which of course has a lot of merit to it, but the original is just so beautiful and sublime that I can't help that feel that this one pales in comparison. I mean, it's hardly pointless though, because it's definitely different, which is better than just, you know, making the song sound the exact same way, right? So from here we move into another staple from the album, you know, a live rendition of Amnesia. So this one opens up with a darkly hollow echo chamber of resonating drones, and we wonder what the hell is even going to be going on until the tapping of cymbals leads us into an incredibly frenetic and fast version of the track. And my goodness, there is so much grit and edge to this one, just blurring past so quickly though. This calamity of sounds coming through the speakers like ghostly spectres though, alongside some very unusual percussive elements that rear their head from time to time. Like, there's something just breathtaking about the whole track here, it's such aggression coming through in the performance, with a highlight being that wonderful descending guitar riff that comes through following the lengthy instrumental sections. And it goes on for such a wonderfully long time though before just all tapering off to let the vocals come in, with Jira giving a very weirdly better vocal performance than what we had on the album's counterpart though, I would argue at least. Like, I feel like that slight push in the tempo just lets the whole thing blur past so brilliantly, especially when you get those wonderful drones for the chorus section where the instruments just continue to build up that cataclysmic storm. I think it's a bit of a highlight on the album, and I might actually prefer it to the version on Love of Life as well, as it has this very tight level of density and intensity that makes it such a wonderful standout track from the album. So much more grit to it and so much more pacing as well, just makes it come across a lot more stronger to me. But yeah, truly fascinating though. Our next track though, we get Love of Life though. Another ferociously overwhelming track, right? So this one opens up with some very unusual keyboard effects before the drums come in. And the guitar begins this very unusual level of lo-fi distortion, it feels. Just looping over and over for a few rounds, becoming this strange hypnotizing experience, one where the drums continue this constant descent before it suddenly breaks free and lets the song it just begin. It lets the band bring in that brilliant riff, the opening of the song that feels so much more recognizable in this particular form. And with us now on the second longest track on the album, we have loads of time to just get comfortable with the onslaught that this track offers us, especially with how it repeats its instrumental bars for so many sections, before finally going into the next section, plus over a few bars here, before Gira just continues that croon that truly launches the song off. So, I should be honest here though, it takes such an incredibly long time for us to actually get to this point on the song though, and I feel like by the time we have, my attention, it's sadly just drifted just a little bit though. Like, it's easy to get lost in the storm that the instrumentals are offering, but it kind of just fails to capture my attention as much as it should be doing. And I have to say as well, this is one of my favourite tracks from the original studio album of Love of Life though, but I feel like there's actually something lacking here though. Now, all that seems to be coming through are these unusual little elements, and then the ferocity of the song's drive that makes the original so fascinating, it seems to just have been given up a bit slightly, making this one a little bit lackluster for me. Like, that tempo is just not quite there though. Like, I don't really understand why I feel this way though, because there's essentially nothing wrong with this performance at all. Like, it's got the menacing macabre nature to it, sure enough, but something seems to be missing. And after navigating through the very lengthy instrumental opener, I don't know, maybe I was hoping for a bit more here perhaps. Maybe. I don't expect myself to like absolutely everything I'm hearing when it comes to any of these albums, I should admit. I think maybe what it was is I had a bit of high expectations of this one because it's such a favourite of mine from the original album, and I was hoping to hear it with a lot more grit and chunk to it. But for some reason it just failed to communicate actually, with this coming across as a little bit thin in some respects. To be fair though, the band still managed to create this wonderful soundscape once again, where the backing vocals glide in from all directions, And although that pacing is a little bit lackluster, as I mentioned, it's still continually maintained for the entirety of the song, except arguably at the end when the whole band just lets it all fade away though, leaving just the guitar and the drums to push it all along. Like, it's not bad in any respect at all, but I think it does pale a bit in comparison to the album's counterpart, at least for myself personally. Like, I can imagine there's a whole host of people who would disagree with such an opinion, and of course you are well within your rights to do so. But at the end of the day, I personally can't say that this particular version of the song communicates enough to me when I hear it. It is what it is. So, in our next track, we get, which is another experimental track in the vein of Jarbo and Larry 7 Experiment. So, this one opens up with a vocal sample, and it begins a sort of story for us to listen to. You have a keyboard playing this ascending and descending scale, it feels, creating a rather strange and ominous vibe, one that creates this setting of intrigue and confusion. It's a very odd one, kind of like a little, to me, it feels like a little bit of a hidden experiment in amongst that sort of collaboration that Jarbo was doing with Larry 7, especially given the fact that it's got the same name as all of the rest of those other tracks, right? It's an interesting moment on the album, and I feel like it helps to sort of tie it in better to the previous studio album's release, giving a sense of coherency in regards to experimenting with sounds and ideas, creating for us as listeners this kind of break in the album that offers a little bit of respite and breathing room, before you get right back into the swing of things with the next track of The Other Side of the World. So this one is that lovely ballad from Jarbo, opening up with that jangly guitar line again. One that perhaps feels a little bit oddly lo-fi with the effect from live recordings, maybe? Perhaps. A bit irrelevant though, but it is nice how Jarbo leads the vocals in much higher register this time, letting her voice climb and soar right over the stage it feels. And whilst I really like the album version, I have to say I adore this vocal performance that Jarbo opts for here. There's something truly wonderful about it, with it resulting in such a unique part of this whole album experience. The whole track feels arguably a little bit more minimalist perhaps, being just good Jarbo and the guitar, which is maybe performed by Jira perhaps. It wouldn't surprise me, to be fair. But then, as a result of it being a bit more minimalist, it perhaps lacks that punch that the rest of the band offers, to the original song. But irrespective of that, it does result in a lovely moment of serenity in a lot of ways. A nice breather after the intensity of what's preceded so much of this album though. And I do feel like it'd be nice to hear the vocal take on a version of the song with the rest of the band. Regardless, it's just nice that it's here at all, Very cool stuff indeed. So, the next track we have is titled Rutting. So this track, alongside the album's closer, is an excerpt from the song In the Eyes of Nature. So this one kind of just throws us into the scene of this very frenetic riff set along the pound of drums in this turbulent little keyboard part. And there's once again some lovely clarity to the instruments here, from the electric guitar to the descending bass to the brief intermittent vocal wails from Jira. And it creates a sudden storm cloud that drifts in from the distance, douses everything in heavy rain before sailing off again. Very interesting, and I do like how it all sounds, but I'll be honest, I don't feel like it really goes much of anywhere, and thus it's not one that I can really say stands out all that much for me, at least in my opinion. So, interjecting here, because I have to re-record this bit because I got confused how the ending of this particular album works, actually. Silly me. So, yes, the penultimate track, God Loves America. This is basically another version of that acoustic-led misery ballad from Gira that croons over the state of America and his miserable interpretation of it. So, with this version of it, we do have that lovely presence to the vocals, especially with that resonant quality that Gira's voice just naturally has, the way his voice just expands in the space of the room, accompanied by just simply the playing of the acoustic guitar, it seems. And you're of course getting the same kind of thing that you had on the album's counterpart though, a bitter expression and sentiment towards America. Here, though, at the sort of end of the album, I feel like this kind of acts as a final sign-off in the particular context, though, ending the sort of turbulent nature of the album on a rather somber acoustic numbers in the forms of, The Other Side of the Wells in this track, actually, the sort of, with both Gira and Jarbo's vocals, just with rather gentle songs, if that makes sense. And I like how it sort of just helps to just sort of end it all on this moment that brings it all down, at least for now. It's very cool as well though. There's a cool moment at the end, sort of in the middle of this track, where when Gira finishes the song, he just says, "Well, that's that." And because of that, I thought that's where the song ended when I was listening to it to write down my thoughts. Very stupid of me. However, following this little remark from Gira, he actually, the whole band suddenly just comes in with a sort of instrumental version of the song "God Loves America" that plays around for a nice amount of time. And it creates this lovely surge of energy that comes forth out of those somber acoustic moments, bringing it all more towards this more logical closer, if that makes sense. So yeah, having to re-record this because I thought that this big band version of "God Loves America" was part of the final track, Omnipotent, when I wrote about it, instead of being a part of this one. Very stupid of me, I don't know why I did that, but in retrospect, I've actually come to realise that it's interesting how the album's actually navigated itself this way, having those acoustic ballads, and then leading into the full band again, showcasing, that sort of big wall of sound once more, just for a few final moments before everything closes off. It kind of helped us create that big sonic wall of noise and strengthen the album in a few nice ways. Very cool stuff. And of course from there, you do move on to the final track of the album, Omnipotent. And this is apparently another excerpt from In the Eyes of Nature that offers us this incredibly doomy monolithic crawl that comes out of nowhere. It kind of dirged a descent so wonderfully out of the silence that starts off the track, these very sort of gloomy ambient notions. And it's odd, But I think there's something very cool here, though, especially with that very slow style that the whole track is offering. It feels to me like one final crawl for the album, that comes across almost like a brief capturing of that classic Swans style, the sort of atonal bludgeoning style that you got during a lot of the very early eras of the band. Very cool and very odd, but I do think it actually closes off the album in such a very interesting and nice way, and it helps to just strengthen, a side of the album that I didn't think was all that great, to be fair. Like, I like the first half, I think the second half lacks a bit, but I do like this closer, to be fair. Interesting stuff. So, apologies to interject here, but had to be mentioned, of course, but without further ado, we'll get back to the original review, I guess. So goodness, what an unusual album this is in a lot of respects, right? I'll be honest, I actually struggle to make heads or tails of this one. There's a lot of stuff I like, and a fair amount that I don't. I find there's nothing inherently wrong with it for the most part, but a lot of the ideas squashed into this one feel a little bit peculiar. So first thing to mention, as I've said, it seems that a fair few elements of this album were actually re-recorded as overdubs in the studio. As to what exactly, it's hard to know for sure, but I do feel like this is an odd choice, as I have mentioned earlier, because it does two different things as a result. One thing is that it makes the experience a little bit disingenuous of what Swans truly sounded like live in their live context, and instead more of a projection, the sort of vision that Gira had for the band and how he wanted it to sound during this time. No, it's a bit hard to explain, but I just feel like going back to record elements, it throws certain parts in confusion, and it makes it hard to envision just standing there and experience it as an audience, which is what I like to do when I'm listening to live albums. However though, one other thing that it actually helps do is actually tie together the whole album experience. Like when we compare this to the previous live album we looked at, Anonymous Bodies in an Empty Room, what we had there was a very poor quality bootleg recording that actually let the album down in a lot of respects. Here, we can actually see what happens if such recordings are polished a bit more, as everything does sound so much better on this particular album. Like there's a wonderful clarity to all the parts, and it makes a much more comfortable listening experience, with the flow being a lot more nice and comfortable. However, conversely, there's still a fair bit I don't like. The splitting of certain songs into segments, like we have had this before on previous albums we've looked at, and I can't help but wonder what happened and why. Perhaps it's a stylistic choice, or perhaps it was necessary, that there were even post edits in the studio that the studio couldn't even say, perhaps. Maybe though. It could even be perhaps the performances just as they were. They were just short instrumental excerpts of the song instead of the full songs. Like, I don't think so, to be fair, truth be told. But maybe that was the case as well. Or maybe just Gira wanted to just highlight certain aspects of this part and that part and not ruin it with the other parts. But like I said, it's so hard to know for sure exactly what goes on here. But regardless of it, it just makes it all feel a little bit odd. And although they're interesting sections and versions of the songs, it's not exactly my favourite thing to do. So one thing I do have to say, as a personal opinion, is how I think, although there's a wonderful coherency to this entire album, I do feel like the sequencing's a little bit off. Like I can see what the intent is here, starting off with the dark macabre songs, building it all up and up and up before tapering it off with a few acoustic numbers. But for some reason, I can't exactly fathom, I actually find these sequencings a little bit exhausting and dull. Like, I don't know why, but on the album's second half here, it just seems to all taper off and fade away though, it just falters, which is a shame considering how strong the first half of this album started. Like, it's like a lot of that momentum that the album kind of built up with the first half ebbed away in the second half, which I don't think everyone's going to agree on, but it is just my experience of it. Like, it's odd, because I don't hate the album in any way, but I just find it weird in a lot of respects. But like as mentioned, in comparison to the band's previous live album of Anonymous Bodies, this is definitely a vast improvement. Like there's so much more clarity to what's happening here, making it much more engaging to actually listen to as a listener. But I do find myself not clicking with it as much as I thought I would. But then I do wonder if that's maybe a fault with myself, maybe just having too high of an expectation. I don't know why. I didn't think it was when it came to listen to one, but maybe that was the problem I had when I did listen to it though. Like, maybe because it was, I'd heard good things about this album, it being a favourite among Swans fans, of course, some Swans fans anyway, and with it being, a live album counterpart to some of my, an era I really adore of Swans, maybe I just expected too much of it, and the album failed to deliver to the standard that I unfairly placed upon it. But maybe, I don't know. But regardless, it just didn't click with me. I do think with the vast majority of albums within the Swans canon though, it is a fascinating relic of their place in time. And this one definitely had a little bit of extra oomph added into, as a result of those studio recordings, right? I'm not a big fan of it personally, but it is interesting at the very least. But definitely for me, a very mixed bag of a live album. Not their worst, but not something I can get all that excited about as a whole. Regardless of what I think though, there's definitely people out there who adore this album. And I can see why though. Out of all the Swans live albums we looked up to at this point, I have to say this is probably one of the best sounding, with some fascinating versions of Love of Life's absolute best tracks, and some really nice surprises here and there in the forms of other tracks as well. So all in all, very cool stuff. So I think with that, we'll be coming to the end of our episode of Weird Music then. Another video for the Swans fans, albeit one of the more unknown albums of course. But I do think it is fascinating exploring all of these various releases though, not just the studio albums, which was my intention when I first started the Swan series in Swans. Learning about the live albums though has truly opened up my understanding of the band in so many ways, and I am grateful that you, the audience, gave me the push to do so. So yeah, Omniscience. Not a favourite of mine, I don't think. There is a lot I like about it, and a lot I don't, but I am definitely glad of the clarity the music actually has. Definitely so much easier to listen to than the last live album we looked at. So, in our next video on Swans, I'm going to be honest, I'm not exactly sure what we're supposed to be doing. My research into what actually comes next is very conflicting at this point, so I've decided to follow the order that we were given on Discogs, despite having already mixed up a few of the albums so far. This means that our next album, the next video on Swans, will be a look at the live bootleg release of Real Love, which was originally released in 1986, but it's also had many re-releases including 1992 and 1996, placing it before and after so many different albums within this period we're currently looking at. So I figured, whatever, I'm just going to get it done and out the way, and then we'll move on to all the other stuff, alright? I think it's actually going to be interesting, because it means we're going to be going back in time, in the Swans canon. But it's going to be interesting to return to the bludgeoning atonality of the early years, even if just for a brief episode. Hopefully it won't take too long to get around, but I will try my best anyway. Should be some fun. In any case, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best, take care, and bye bye for now. Bye bye.